There are movie stars, and then there are legends. And Robert Redford, the Sundance Kid himself, has always lived in that rarefied air. To the public, he was the golden boy of Hollywood. Flawless smile, rugged charisma, the man every woman adored and every man admired. But what if I told you, behind the charm, behind the camera-ready cool, lived a man haunted by love? Not the polished love stories that make magazine covers, but the kind that scars the soul. At 89 years old, Robert Redford revealed the women who shaped his life, the ones who loved him, broke him, challenged him, and finally gave him peace. These weren't tabloid flings. These were the hidden truths of a man the world thought it knew. So let's peel back the curtain and uncover the untold loves of Robert Redford. The first love that defined his youth, Lola Van Wagenen. Before the fame, before the flashing lights, there was Lola Van Wagenen. Long before Robert Redford became a household name, he was just another young man chasing half-formed dreams. And Lola was the woman who saw him not as the future movie star, but simply as Bob. They married in 1958, back when he was still a nobody in Hollywood. Together they built a family, 4 children, a home, a sense of normalcy in a life that would soon be anything but ordinary. But Hollywood isn't kind to stability. The long nights, the constant travel, the endless pressures of fame, all of it ate away at the foundation they had built. By 1985, after nearly 3 decades together, they quietly divorced. No screaming headlines, no bitter public feud. Just 2 people who realized they'd grown apart in ways that couldn't be fixed. Yet Redford never stopped speaking of Lola with respect, sometimes with quiet sadness, like a man acknowledging a wound that never quite healed. She had been his anchor during those chaotic early years, and anchors, even when released, leave an imprint on the soul. But Lola was only the beginning. The co-star who captured his heart, Natalie Wood. Fast forward to the 1960s. Hollywood was still a dream factory, and Robert Redford's career was on the rise. That's when he met Natalie Wood. To audiences, Natalie was Hollywood royalty. Luminous, fragile, almost mythic. To Redford, still carving out his place, she was both colleague and enigma. They worked together on Inside Daisy Clover in 1965, and this property is condemned the following year. On screen, the chemistry was undeniable. He was the charming drifter, she the vulnerable dreamer. Together, they embodied the restless spirit of a generation. Off-screen, whispers followed them everywhere. Rumors of a romance, speculation of a bond that went deeper than friendship. For Redford, Natalie was more than just beautiful. She was fragile in ways that stirred his protective instincts. For Natalie, Robert represented something different, a man unwilling to be consumed by Hollywood's chaos. But the story of Natalie Wood ended in tragedy. In 1981, her sudden and mysterious death shook Hollywood to its core. Redford rarely spoke about her publicly, but when he did, there was always a tenderness in his words, as if her memory was too delicate to expose fully. Whatever they shared, whether a fleeting romance or an unspoken bond, Natalie left an imprint he carried for the rest of his life. The passion that burned bright. Barbra Streisand. If Natalie was a spark, Barbra Streisand was wildfire. By 1973, Redford had already become a leading man, and Streisand was a superstar. Together, they starred in The Way We Were, and something extraordinary happened. The film wasn't just a love story. It was a cultural phenomenon. Audiences could feel the tension, the longing, the heartbreak, not just in the script, but in the actors themselves. Barbra was bold, fearless, and unafraid to dive into raw emotion. Redford, in contrast, was measured and reserved, always guarding his privacy. Oil and water on paper, yet on screen, magic. Off camera, their dynamic was just as complicated. Streisand later admitted she was captivated by him, calling him the golden boy. Redford, however, kept his distance. For him, her intensity was both admirable and overwhelming. Their romance never took root off-screen, but their chemistry became immortalized in film history. Streisand herself confessed he may have been the one who slipped away. For Redford, she was the love story he could only live in fiction, not reality, and perhaps that's why the film's bittersweet ending still resonates, because it mirrored a truth neither of them could escape. The woman who changed his world, Sonia Braga. By the late 1980s, Robert Redford had done it all. Actor, director, producer, Hollywood heavyweight. But then came Sonia Braga, the Brazilian actress who was a storm in human form. Known for fearless performances in Dona Flor and her two husbands in Kiss of the Spider, Braga radiated passion and fire. He lived unapologetically, and for Robert Redford, a man defined by restraint and self-control, that quality alone was magnetic. Sonia Braga was bold, fiery, and alive in a way that seemed to defy the carefully measured existence Redford had crafted for himself. For decades, he had been known as the golden boy, who rarely let the world peek behind his mask of composure. But Braga, she tore straight through that exterior. Their relationship wasn't just romantic. It was elemental. It carried the electricity of two thunderstorms colliding. Braga brought chaos, laughter, and raw intensity, while Redford was used to being the quiet observer, the calm presence in the room. But for once in his life, he wasn't standing on the outside looking in. He was right there in the middle of the storm. Friends who watched their connection unfold described it in almost cinematic terms. Intoxicating, passionate, but ultimately volatile. Braga thrived on the edge of extremes, feeding off intensity, spontaneity, and risk. Redford, on the other hand, had always leaned on discipline, retreating into solitude when the noise of Hollywood became too loud. He craved balance. She craved fire. And for a while, the clash between those two energies created something unforgettable. But passion, no matter how thrilling, isn't always sustainable. The very things that drew Redford to Braga, her unpredictability, her fierce independence, her boundless energy, were the same things that made it impossible for them to last. They were two powerful forces that could never quite align. And yet, despite the breakup, Redford never dismissed her impact on his life. Years later, he still spoke of Sonia Braga with genuine admiration. He called her a force of nature, someone who could never be contained, never be tamed, and never be forgotten. She wasn't the woman he built a home with. She wasn't the one who stayed, but she was the flame he could never fully extinguish, the reminder that even the most controlled man can be undone by love that burns too hot. The love he couldn't let go. Sibylle Szaggars. After storms like Braga, Redford found himself craving something entirely different, not fire, but calm. And that's when Sibylle Szaggars entered his life. Unlike his past loves, Sibylle wasn't tied to the chaos of Hollywood. She wasn't an actress, a starlet, or a name that filled magazine covers. She was a German-born painter, a woman of quiet artistry whose life revolved around creativity and nature. For a man who had spent decades dodging the harsh glare of fame, this difference was more than refreshing. It was healing. They met in the 1990s during a chapter of Redford's life when he had begun retreating more and more into Sundance, Utah. Far from the sound stages and red carpets, he poured himself into his love for the mountains, the outdoors, and the sanctuary of silence. And in Sibylle, he found someone who understood that part of him without question. Their relationship wasn't forged in the noise of Hollywood premieres. It grew slowly, steadily, in the stillness of nature. Hikes, quiet evenings, the shared language of art and creativity. Sibylle didn't demand his attention in public. She shared it with him in private. After more than a decade together, They married in 2009 in Hamburg, Germany. The ceremony was intimate, stripped of spectacle, a reflection of the life they had chosen to build together. For Redford, Sibylle represented something rare: peace. She wasn't the wildfire, the spark, or the storm. She was the steady hand after years of turbulence. As Redford entered the twilight of his life, Sibylle gave him the one thing Hollywood never could: stability. If passion once consumed him, Sibylle offered calm. And sometimes, calm is the greatest love of all. The romance that never ended. Jane Fonda. Few Hollywood pairings ever felt as natural, as easy, and as inevitable as Robert Redford and Jane Fonda. From the first moment they appeared together on screen in Barefoot in the Park in 1967, audiences were convinced they were destined for one another. Their chemistry was so playful, so effortless, it was almost impossible to believe it wasn't real. Over a decade later, they reunited in The Electric Horseman in 1979, their youthful spark now seasoned by experience. And then, nearly 40 years after their first collaboration, they came together again in Our Souls at Night in 2017. Two widowed neighbors finding unexpected love in old age. To viewers, it felt less like acting and more like watching two people finally surrender to something that had always been waiting in the wings. And yet, off-screen, that romance never materialized. Redford and Fonda were close, deeply close, but they never crossed the line into lovers. Fonda admitted in interviews that she sometimes wished they had been more than just co-stars. Redford, in turn, spoke openly about his admiration for her courage, her activism, and her refusal to play by Hollywood's rules. But timing, caution, and perhaps fear held them back. Redford was famously private. Fonda often lived boldly, unafraid of scandal. Perhaps they worried romance would destroy the trust they had built as friends. What endured between them was something more elusive, a connection that flirted with love but never defined itself as such. Watching them reunite late in life, audiences couldn't help but wonder what might have been. Jane Fonda wasn't a lost love. She was a reminder of one. Proof that sometimes the most enduring bonds aren't romantic at all, but are instead built on respect, trust, and unspoken admiration. Reflections at 89. From the outside, Robert Redford's life always looked golden. Awards stacked on his shelves, a career that spanned generations, the title of Hollywood legend secured decades ago. But if you look closer, beneath the surface, his life tells a much more human story, one shaped as much by heartbreak as by triumph. From Lola, the anchor who grounded him, to Natalie, the fragile spark gone too soon, to Barbra, the one who slipped away, to Sonia, the storm he couldn't resist, to Sibylle, the calm that endured, to Jane, the connection that lingered just out of reach. Each woman was a chapter, each left a mark, and together they shaped the man behind the movie star. At 89, Robert Redford's legacy isn't just his films. It's the loves, the losses, and the lessons that made him human. And that's the part Hollywood never filmed. So now I'll leave you with this. Which of these love stories touched you the most? Drop your thoughts below. And if you love uncovering Hollywood's untold truths, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and ring the bell, because the next story might just change the way you see a legend forever.